is a pleasure to introduce this first session of the third series of the shelves. And as you have seen, this session is recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, just tell us or leave the session, I'm afraid. We are storing all these recordings on the YouTube channel of Filosofia Antica Torino. So this is, as I said, the first session of the third series of the shelves. This is a series organized by our group, Filosofia Antica Torino, and CUP, in particular, CUP Classics and Philosophy. And I'm very grateful to Michael Sharp, who initially accepted and encouraged us to organize this thing. I am Federico Petrucci. I'm Associate Professor of Ancient Philosophy in Turin. Today's chair will be Giulia De Cesaris, who is now postdoc in Leuven, and from November 2023 will be Marie Curie Fellow in Turin. And Arianna Piazzalunga is PhD in the Universities of Turin and Geneva. So I will immediately ask Giulia to share the session, but first I will remind that CUP is offering a 40% discount on the book presented this year to those attending any of the events. Just write Michael Sharp in order to get the discount on this. And so, please, Giulia.
Yes, hi, welcome everybody. Well, you can find Michael's email in the chat in case you were wondering where to find it. I will just very briefly introduce how the event works. So the format is just after those of the past years. So first, I will invite the author, Tsouna, to introduce her volume and guide us through the main philosophical issues that this commentary on the Charmides touches upon. Next, Raphael, Woolf, and Alex Long kindly accepted to offer a critical examination of the book and of the main issues that it raises. And lastly, we will open the floor to the debate, and with both the author, the discussants, and whoever wants to participate, obviously, is welcome to do so and ask questions. So let me just very briefly introduce Tsouna, who is professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her expertise covers an exceptionally wide range of topics in ancient philosophy, extending from Socrates, the minor Socratics, Plato, Aristotle, Hellenistic philosophy, especially Philodemus, and Roman philosophy. And just to give an idea of the variety of philosophical topics that she has worked on, among her published books, we can mention the volume co-edited with Giovanni Indelli entitled Philodemus on Choices and Avoidances, the Epistemology of the Cyrenaic Schools, published by CUP in 1998, the Ethics of Philodemus, and a collection of essays on the Socratics and the Hellenistic schools entitled Knowledge, Virtue, and Happiness, published in 2012. And besides all of these works and the book of the Charmides that she will present today, she has two further books in progress. One entitled The Normativity of Nature in Hellenistic Philosophy, which is to appear in the series Cambridge Elements in Ancient Philosophy, edited by James Warren, and a monograph which is provisionally entitled Imperfect Cities, Imperfect Lives, Plato's Story on Human Decline in Republic 8 and 9. And well, after this, Vula, please, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giulia, for this very generous introduction. Many thanks to the organizers of this event. It's an honor and a pleasure to be invited. And many thanks, of course, to Alex Long and Raphael Woolf. I'm very grateful that you have accepted to give us your comments. I'll try to talk about 20 minutes, no more, and then, turn it over to the commentators. So of all of Plato's so-called Socratic dialogues, the Charmides is by far the most complex and the most challenging. From the point of view of drama, it is a superbly crafted story of a double dialectical encounter narrated by Plato's Socrates to an intimate and anonymous friend. Methodologically and philosophically, it presents itself as a major breakthrough in Plato's thinking about method, epistemology, and logic, as well as ethics and politics. Socrates has a double capacity in the Charmides. He's the narrator and he's also one of the protagonists. The narration begins with an elaborate and enigmatic prologue, which occupies approximately 1/4 of the work, and it introduces the three main characters, Socrates and his two successive interlocutors, the young and exceptionally handsome Charmides and his cousin and guardian Critias. They represent two of Plato's relatives, as we all know, whom the audience of Plato knows to have been the ringleaders of the 30. The respective portraits of these two personages have received extremely different, indeed diametrically opposite interpretations in the literature, tied to different or diametrically opposite interpretations about the purpose of the Charmides as a whole. So some contend that Charmides and Critias are shown in a positive light. Others argue to the opposite effect, claiming that Plato wishes to defend Socrates against the taint of association precisely by stressing the flaws of the two cousins. I do reject in my approach these tendencies and plainly reject the idea that Plato's characters are chosen for quasi-biographical or biographical or strategical reasons instead of philosophical reasons, which I believe to be the reasons why they are chosen. I argue that these portraits are deliberately ambiguous, and I unfold that argument throughout the book in different phases. In respect of their potential for goodness or badness, the level of their dedication to philosophy, and of course the exact nature of their relation to Socrates. The prologue is not just drama, however. It frames and illustrates key philosophical themes that will resurface in one way or another later in the work. They include the ideas that sophrosini, or temperance, the virtue under examination in the Charmides, is the source of the greatest benefits for a human being, that virtue amounts to psychic health, that the soul has primacy over the body, that caring for the soul is all important, and that the way to do so is to engage in philosophical logoi, arguments. Significantly, the opening scene offers perspectives from which sophrosini is shown to be connected to self-knowledge. This, in my view, is the central theme and the scarlet thread tying together apparently disparate parts of the dialogue. Allow me to digress for a moment in order to sketch out what I believe to be Plato's tactics in that regard. One finds, I contend, two competing conceptions of self-knowledge at play throughout the dialogue, one belonging to Critias, the other associated easily with Plato's Socrates. The former conception constitutes the sole direct subject of the elenchus, whereas the latter serves mainly as a reference point for comparison, contrast, and further reflection on the part of the readers. The interplay of these two conceptions gives philosophical unity to the work and also contributes to its dramatic unity. For each of them is related to a corresponding protagonist and is variously illustrated by reference to him. We shall see quite a bit about Critias's conception of self-knowledge, so I want to say a word about Socrates. Many interpreters have noted to different effects that Socrates' narrative in the Charmides appears calculated to constantly remind us of the apology, and in particular Socrates' effort to understand the verdict of Apollo that no man was wiser than he was. His attainment of an enhanced sort of self-knowledge and the philosophical mission that he undertook as a service to a god. Generally, Socrates shows considerable epistemic humility and devotes his life to the dialectical scrutiny of one's beliefs in the hope of getting to know better himself and help others to do the same. This is in Apology 28e and many other places. He believes I think he's shown to believe in the existence of divinities. He reveres God, and he claims to know that humans must obey the God's commands. The dynamics between the two conceptions, this one and Critias's conception as it develops in the Charmides, develop in the course of the dialogue, and they offer an entry point that I believe is fully legitimized by the text. Parts of my overall interpretation depend on accepting this distinction, the distinction between the two conceptions. But most of my analysis can stand without it. Even if one rejects it, the analysis still, I think, can stand. Socrates' conversation with Charmides aims precisely to help the youth discover something important about himself, whether his soul is sufficiently temperate or whether it needs to be charmed by means of arguments. Socrates proceeds on the assumption spelled out for the first and only time in the Charmides under the rubric of the best method, this is a quote, that if one possesses the virtue, one must also have some sense of it and hold some belief about it regarding the kind of thing it is. That is, one must be able to describe or define the virtue under consideration. And indeed, young Charmides does make two successive attempts to do so, one consisting in the definition of temperance as a kind of quietness, hysikiotis, the other defining temperance as eidos, a sense of shame. Both these arguments have received a very bad press, on the basis that they are believed to be vitiated by ambiguity and paralogism, that they are believed to make illegitimate use of counterexamples and to be anti-pedagogical as well as invalid. In chapters 3 and 4 of the book, respectively, I argue that this is not the case, and that I do so by laying out the arguments in detail, the premises, and how we move towards the conclusions. Not surprisingly, Charmides proves unable to defend the third definition that he advances, which is discussed in chapter 5, namely that temperance is doing one's own. For as he makes clear, this isn't his own belief, but someone else's. The formula occurs, of course, in the definition of justice in Republic 4, but importantly, it is also central to the political debate between oligarchs and democrats at the time when the action of the Charmides is supposed to take place. Critias's known political commitments make him a natural defender of that definition, and chapter 6 endeavors to do justice to his ingenious reformulation of that definition into, quote, the doing and making of good things, end quote, and also to assess the modular argument by which Critias defends that definition against Socrates. In my view, self-knowledge takes center stage at just that point. The reason why Critias is shown to abandon the definition lies precisely in his admission that if it held true, one could act temperately but remain ignorant of that fact. And as a committed intellectualist, which is exactly how he comes across, Critias finds this absolutely intolerable, and thus he is led, as if by association, to think of the Delphic oracle and declare that in truth temperance is just this, knowing oneself. Socrates puts up significant resistance when Critias specifies exactly what he means by this. In a passage that on my interpretation plays a pivotal role, that's 165c to 166e, and is discussed in chapter 8, he presses Critias to specify what sophrosine, or knowing oneself, is of, and what it is for. To wit, if temperance is knowing something, then we should think of it as an episteme or techne of some sort. And if so, then it must have a distinct object or domain and must perform a certain function. Critias retorts that in fact the science equivalence to temperance is unique in that regard. Quote, while all the other sciences are something other than themselves and not of themselves, this one alone is the science of both of all the other sciences and of itself, and it is added later of non-science. And the shorthand used for all this is the science of science, which is a shorthand I'm going to be using. This science then, in our own terms, could be called a strictly reflexive science, and also a directive one. It governs the other sciences insofar as they are cases of science, although, as it becomes totally clear, it can't access their respective objects and is intransitive or intransparent. These are different terms used in the literature in that regard. On the traditional account, which is almost universally endorsed, here we have a passage from the Socratic Socrates to a Platonic Socrates. And this approach, this idea, this traditional approach, has far-fetching consequences for the interpretation of the two arguments developed in the second half of the Charmides. In sharp contrast, on my own reading, Socrates' aforementioned concession, that is, that there can be a science that is only of itself and of nothing else, is a mere dialectical move intended to allow the discussion to continue. Socrates' own view, in fact, is that temperance, like every other form of knowledge, must have an object and function distinct from itself. And this view, on my own interpretation, is the one that eventually prevails and is vindicated to the extent allowed by the dialectical form of the argument. The traditional reading, on the other hand, I claim, is unfaithful to the text, violates the principle of charity, and disregards the say what you believe rule of Socratic dialectic. But let us move on. The refutation of Critias's last definition as a science of science is motivated by a twofold aporia, puzzle, expressed by Socrates. First, is such a science, a strictly reflexive science, really possible? And second, even conceding that it is possible, is it beneficial in any way for us? The argument from relatives, discussed in chapter 10, addresses the first corner of the puzzle, while the argument from benefit, discussed in chapter 11 of my book, aims to answer the second. The argument from relatives examines four groups of relatives in order to illustrate just what Socrates finds perplexing in respect of a science of science. It is hard to imagine, he argues, that there can be a sight of sight and not of color, a hearing of hearing and not of sound, a desire of itself and not of pleasure, an eros or erotic love of itself and not of the beautiful, a fear of itself but not of the dreadful, or a belief of itself, but of nothing believable. Worse, a double of itself, but not of half, a larger than itself, but not of something smaller. Now, the usual objection is that, in fact, it is perfectly plausible to think of someone who is in love with love, but or who fears one's fear. And the question is, what's wrong with reflexivity in these cases? There's nothing wrong, hence the argument undermines its own point. But this criticism is off the mark. For the counterexamples are construed so as to illustrate strict reflexivity, not reflexivity simpliciter, nor any form of self-referentiality whatsoever. Socrates' intuition is, I believe, sound. It seems infeasible to think of such psychological phenomena without relating them at some level to a distinct object. Casanova was in love with love, to be sure, but also, incidentally, with one or more women at a given time. A claustrophobic person fears his own fear, but also the little dark room. And the similar remarks, I claim, hold for belief and by analogy for knowledge. Is the argument from relatives successful? Against the traditional view, I believe it is, insofar as it goes. given that the argument proceeds by analogy and induction and depends on the consent of the interlocutor, we shouldn't ask whether it demonstrates its point, but whether it commands Critias, the premises command Critias's consent, and whether they can convincingly, though not decisively, support the conclusion. And I argue that the answer should be affirmative on both counts. Having shown that the kind of reflexivity involved in the science of science is deeply problematic, the elenchus now turns to the second horn of the puzzle. Granting, for the sake of the investigation, that the science of science is possible, the interlocutors proceed to explore whether or how it would be good for us. The reasoning on my interpretation has the form of a complex reductio, which proceeds in 5 successive steps as follows. 1, at the outset, Socrates questions an assumption that he and Critias have heavily relied on. Granting that the science of science is possible, quote, why or how does it make it any more possible for one to know what one knows and what one doesn't? Or, more pressingly, how knowing what one knows and doesn't know is the same thing as that other knowledge, i.e. the science of science. 2, the science of science, substantive content, derives from the relation of each first-order science with an object or domain distinct from itself. So the substantive content of medicine derives from the fact that it is of health and disease, so from the object. But the science of science has no such object, and hence it cannot be knowledge what? That is, knowledge of substantive content. Step 3, despite the conclusion that has just been reached, Socrates asks us to imagine a society governed by temperate rulers possessing the science of science. But on my reading, this is a counterfactual. This is not a thought experiment that is supposed to establish a point. It's a counterfactual thought experiment relying on a premise that has already been refuted, in fact, has just been refuted. Such a science, and I quote from the text, Socrates says, has appeared nowhere, end quote, 172b. So the science of science could still bring advantages, suggests Socrates, but they would be lesser ones, learning more easily, discerning more clearly, judging more reliably. And if so, Socrates points out, temperance would be relatively valueless. Not completely valueless, but the idea is, for such a cardinal virtue, these aren't the kinds of advantages that can meet the case. Step 4, Socrates now proposes that the counterfactual premise be conceded and asks the question anew. Supposing that temperance, qua science of science, is indeed possible, and also supposing that it involves substantive knowledge, how exactly is it a great good? To answer this, Socrates describes a dream, namely a society operating faultlessly under the guidance of scientific rulers, a city that seems strange and out of place, atopon, whose subjects are represented as mere instruments of scientific achievement, as vessels of knowledge, and whose collective way of life appears completely disconnected from the intuitive goal of happiness. The dream, I argue, brings matters to a head, for it confronts Critias with 2 mutually exclusive and equally undesirable alternatives. Either temperance is not a science of science, or it is identical with this latter, but it cannot secure happiness. Step 5, and the final step. Critias is now brought to specify that what he means by living scientifically is, in fact, living scientifically in respect of certain things, namely good and evil. Strict reflexivity makes it impossible for a single science to have 2 different objects, that is, itself as well as something distinct from itself. And hence, the science of science must be something different from the science producing happiness, the science of good and evil. Looking back at the dream, we now realize what its nightmarish quality is due to. It has to do, in fact, with the absence of such a knowledge, the knowledge of good and evil. The rulers of that society are mere managers, running everything on the basis of an expertise that is, in a way, strictly reflexive. It revolves around itself and is unconcerned with the welfare of individuals or the states. Taken together, the argument from relatives and the argument from benefit constitute a massive, extremely impressive, if not totally conclusive, refutation of Critias's definition of Socrocini as a strictly reflective science. Socrates' final summary, however, is not at all exuberant. It is, in fact, composed in a self-critical mode. And in chapter 12, I argue that he is in part right to be self-critical. He justifiably holds himself partly responsible for allowing the inquiry to go so long about something that might even be incoherent or certainly doesn't seem to be very valuable, for proposing concessions that are unwarranted by the argument, and for entertaining, together with Critias, what seems to be a contradiction, claiming that one can know somehow what one doesn't know in any way at all. This criticism, of course, strikes at Critias' science of science, but it might be also undermining the Socratic enterprise. For Socrates claims to be ignorant about, quote, the most important things, and yet cross-examines his interlocutors in order to make judgments about epistemic content, judge what he himself and others know or don't know, but believe they do. And moreover, his method appears or might appear to imply a paradox, namely that one can be in a position to know what one doesn't. Both these objections are prima facie plausible or quite plausible, but neither, in my view, is totally damning or conclusive. But to answer them fully, one would need to look, of course, beyond the Charmides to other Platonic works. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bula, for this very rich introduction. I'm sorry, we didn't decide for the order of the discussants to intervene, so I don't know if either Raphael or Alex have any preference in this respect.
I'm fine either way. Sorry to make it difficult.
Okay.
But,
No. Sorry. I should have decided this in advance, and I did. So, well, I will say that Raphael, you go first because you were discussing with Wool already before. So sorry, Alex. So Raphael Woolf is professor of philosophy at King's College London. His interests include Plato, Aristotle, Hellenistic philosophy, and Cicero, about whom he has just curated the entry on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Among his numerous contributions, I will limit myself to recalling his book on Cicero, entitled Cicero, the Philosophy of a Roman Skeptic, published by Routledge, and the recent volume, Rereading Ancient Philosophy, Old Chestnuts and Sacred Cows, which he co-edited with Verity Art and published in 2017 by CUP. So thank you, Raphael, for being here and having accepted to discuss Bula's volume. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Julia, and thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Bula, for giving us this chance to discuss the book. So I've got to start, interests of full disclosure. So something that is indeed not published yet, Julia, but will be hopefully in the summer is a monograph on the Charmides that I've recently completed. So thank you to CUP in their wisdom have thought that it was quite worthwhile having two books on the Charmides in quick succession. And I think Bula and I, we know each other's work. We've spoken about it. Bula's been very supportive and helpful to me as I've been writing my work. And I think we agree that our approaches are sort of nicely complementary. So other than kind of just for transparency reasons mentioning this, I'm gonna be actually quite narrow in my remarks. I mean, I'm only gonna, it's such a rich and interesting book. I'm really only gonna pick up sort of one or two points from it. But one thing I know Alex is going to say a little bit about the form of Wohler's book, so I'll try not to say too much. But I wanted to say that I hope my monograph is untypical in some ways, but in form it's fairly typical. It's a monograph. It's a bit partisan. It's a bit polemical. It's trying to make a case and sort of contrast it with other cases. Wohler and I both actually agree that the Charmides, as much and perhaps more than any Platonic work, is subject legitimately to a wide variety of interpretive approaches. And I wanted to really, as a question for Wohler about the format of our own book, I mean, I think this idea of an interpretative commentary, I think works really well. And I think the reason it works well is that it manages to both have the virtues of a commentary, which is that it's able to kind of set out the kind of interpretive landscape, but also the virtues of a monograph in that it manages to give a kind of substantive interpretive position of its own. And as I say, I thought that worked really well. I'm sort of curious as to how Wohler sort of came by this format. It's not a typical commentary. It doesn't have the sort of line by line stuff, which I think, would makes it much harder to also give a substantive interpretation of a work as a whole. But because of the way it's constructed, it manages to give such an interpretation, but also, manages to give a proper sense of the interpretive options that have been out there. So I'm just curious to ask about how Wohler came upon that particular format, whether it was something that struck her as particularly appropriate for the Charmides, for writing about Plato. Maybe it'll set a precedent, but I was really interested and curious about the form of Wohler's book. So that's just the first thing I'm going to say. The second thing I'm going to say is about, you'll be pleased to hear, is about an aspect of Wohler's interpretation of the Charmides, but it's also going to be about form and method. It's kind of a bit of an obsession of mine at the moment, and I do talk about this in the monograph at quite some length. It's about a particular aspect of the challenge of reading a Platonic dialogue, and that's about the question of the relationship between Plato, the author, and in this case, Socrates, his main character. And in particular, the idea that the form of a Platonic work, the fact that there are characters talking to each other who aren't Plato, gives at least the scope for a critical distance between Plato, the author, and any of his characters, including the leading character. Now, I think something I found very interesting about Wohler's approach is that I think she acknowledges this very explicitly and has some very interesting things to say about ways in which the Charmides, for example, might be critical of aspects of Socratic philosophy and Socratic method that we're familiar with from other works. And so what I want to do is kind of maybe push this idea a bit further and suggest that not only is there scope for, as it were, intellectual critical distancing between Plato and Socrates, but I don't know if this is quite the right way to put it, but sort of ethical critical distancing as well. I have in mind here the idea that, whatever one might think of Socrates' arguments, and maybe they work, maybe they don't work, and maybe Plato meant them to work, maybe he didn't. There's still a kind of, it's certainly not a universal assumption, but a kind of very prevalent assumption that Socrates is in some ways the moral hero of these works. And I just want to make this point about the form of the work, and I think particularly given that the Charmides is a narrated dialogue. And again, Wohler is very good on this, the idea that gives us a particular, it's written so as to be perspectival. It's formally perspectival. It gives us one person's take on a particular set of proceedings that went on in the Palaestra of Taurius, whenever exactly the Charmides is set, which is a question we won't go into right now. So first move of mine is to say, look, given all that, and given I think that Woolf herself kind of emphasizes these points, I think we have the idea that there is at least room for the idea of a critical distancing between Plato and, in this, let's talk about Socrates. And I'm going to just try and, as it were, as I say, take that one step further and maybe call into question whether there's a real moral critique being mounted of Socrates, or at least, I suppose this is probably the way I would want to put it, that he's a figure of great moral ambiguity in this work. I mean, I would probably claim in other works as well, but let's stick to the Charmides. And I want to maybe the way I want to do this, I think, is maybe just say a few things. And by the way, please feel free to cut me off if I'm going on too long. But what I'm going to do is kind of think about a little bit about Critias, about Chaerephon, and then about Charmides, in order to kind of into the discussion some issues to do with the way Socrates is portrayed and what we might think the relation between the character Socrates and the author Plato is. So I'm going to start off with Critias, and I'm going to, sorry, I'm going to quote, because I want to make sure that I'm going to, here's the book, and I'm going to sort of read, which seems a bit weird somehow, but I want to obviously make sure I'm using your words. And I'm going to start with this is kind of page 11 to 12, more or less. And you tell me if I'm wrong about this, but it seems to me that, again, you very nicely capture the moral ambiguity of Critias. And I kind of agree. I think we're roughly in agreement about the way I'm not in favor of the cartoon villain reading of him. I think I think you're absolutely right that he's a very ambiguous figure. But I thought it was interesting that the way you kind of develop this thought is by reference to the character of Socrates, and you kind of say, to the extent that he's a bit like Socrates, they're his good points. And to the extent that he kind of deviates from Socrates, they're his bad points. And maybe I'm reading more there than is in your text. But one particular bit I wanted to bring out, it's where you say on page 12, so Plato underscores, so you say Critias's dialectical conduct also exhibits elements alien to Socrates' ethos and goals. And then you go on to say Plato underscores Critias's aristocratic pride, his violent outburst at Charmides when the youth makes a joke at his expense, his allegation that Socrates is after victory rather than truth, and so on. And I just want to maybe focus on one element of what you say there, of that charge sheet against Critias, as it were. And that's the bit, I'm not sure if this was the bit you were thinking of, but it certainly seems relevant, where it's where Charmides says, maybe this is talking about temperance as doing one's own things, yeah. And it's where Charmides says, well, maybe the guy who, of course, they're all pretending it wasn't Critias's proposal at the moment, and Socrates, Charmides says, well, maybe the guy who was who came up with this formula didn't know what he was talking about either. And you do indeed get what looks like a kind of an outburst, doesn't it? 162 C to D. Do you think Charmides says Critias that just because you don't know what the person meant, that the person doesn't know either? But that's preceded, as you kind of point out, Woolf, at the beginning of that 162C paragraph, by Socrates. And this is going to be my rather sort of boring, repetitive point, that this is all seen through Socrates' eyes. And the question would be, why do we have to assume, and I'm not saying you do assume, but I'm raising this as a question, why do we have to assume that, just because a character sees something in a particular way, that we're supposed to think that's endorsed as the right way to look at things by the author? So Socrates says, Critias was clear, interestingly, doesn't say clear to whom, that he'd long been, champing at the bit and wanting to show off in front of Charmides and the others, and he could scarcely contain himself, and he's certainly very provoked by Charmides' remark, and then he makes this little outburst. And I suppose I want to say two things about that. So firstly, again, just to emphasize the boring point, it's Socrates who labels him that way. And it seems to me that there's no necessity to read off the way Socrates labels another character as the way that that character is supposed to be taken by Plato, the author, or by us as the reader. I suppose, so there's a question of whether that's even, you know, a completely reliable way to characterize Critias. I suppose the second point, relatedly, is that doesn't Critias have every justification for behaving the way he does? I mean, Socrates has flagrantly, and I'm tempted to say, I mean, if you look at places like 162b, you know, did you hear this account from someone stupid? Charmides, and of course Charmides says no, it's somebody very wise. But I mean, Socrates has brought in this possibility of it's just a stupid account, and he's just given this flagrantly uncharitable exposition of why doing one's own things is a ridiculous account to give. And I suppose it strikes me that you can read Critias's response as completely reasonable, and Socrates is being willfully provocative. I mean, Charmides is provocative too, but then Charmides is getting in on the act that I think Socrates has started. So it seems to me there's a way of reading Socrates as at least kind of morally ambiguous, and that his own sort of labeling of Critias as the guy who's doing the sort of, you know, the bad stuff, the getting competitive, as something that we don't have to take necessarily at face value. So that's I just wanted to say that little bit about Critias. Moving on to Chaerephon now. Very interesting, isn't it, the stuff about Chaerephon being monikos, and it's something that Woolf and I both spend a bit of time talking about. I think you mentioned his monikos nature 2 or 3 times, and okay, so here comes the boring point, right? It's Socrates who labels him as monikos, and I wondered, Woolf, that again, whether you weren't sort of taking Socrates' view slightly too much on trust, if I can put it like that. So I'm thinking of, say, page 59, where you say, you know, unlike the manic Chaerephon, of course, labeled as such by Socrates, right, who does not control his emotions and gestures, Socrates appears to be master of himself. And then a few lines later, in other words, he's depicted as having sophrosune, temperance, in, okay, admittedly, this ordinary sense of the term, maybe not in an ultimately philosophical sense, but there's already, it seems to me, again, and tell me if this wasn't your intention, Woolf, but it seems to me it looks a bit like there's already a kind of framing of Socrates is the good guy, Chaerephon is a bit falling short of moral perfection, and that's because of what Socrates says about him. And again, my response is simply, why should we, so firstly, why in principle, why from a formal point of view, given it's what one character says about another, should we take it that that's how you're supposed to take these characters? And secondly, again, this is kind of parallel to my thought about Critias. What's so monikos about being sort of excited and relieved and delighted at seeing a good friend come back from a fierce battle in one piece? Just because Socrates says it doesn't mean it's so, right? And it seems to me that, you know, other options are available that actually can't, you know, sorry, Chaerephon is reacting perfectly understandably and legitimately. And Socrates is this really weird guy, right? He's come back from this fierce battle, seemingly affectless. I mean, I don't want to put it into too Aristotelian terms, but, you know, why say he's temperate? Why not say he's insensate, for example, if I wanted to put it in terms of Aristotelian character virtue? And it seems to me, I want to suggest is the text at least leaves that open for us to decide, and doesn't actually decide on our behalf just by having Socrates put it like that. Okay, that's Chaerephon. Finally, and this is going to be very quick actually, something about Charmides, and this is really, Woolf, this is something that has kind of, I feel a bit like Critias now myself, because I've read a lot, I'm sure you have too, I've read a lot of accounts of the Charmides where there's a kind of train of thought that goes roughly to the effect, well, because we know Charmides turned out badly, and we do know that, and as you rightly point out, you know, that beautiful, I mean, it's chilling, but it's beautifully written, isn't it? The way the Charmides ends with this clear, you can't, I think it's not in question that there's a foreshadowing of Critias and Charmides' role in the 30. But then there's kind of, you know, you see this often in the literature, there's an assumption that because Charmides turned out bad, then he must have broken away from Socrates. Socrates didn't really have an effect on him. There wasn't much of an influence there after all. And I think, you know, my sort of question there is, well, and again, something you say on page 298, so I'm sort of skipping right to the end. I'm afraid I'm leaving out all the meat here, Woolf, because I am slightly obsessed with these kind of methodological questions at the moment. But on page 298, you say, we are guided to look at him telescopically. I think it's a really nice way to put it. Very, very lovely metaphor. From the vantage point of his own maturity in the setting of Athens after its defeat in the Great War and the establishment of the 30. But then you say we are in a position to know that the cousins' grand plan of compelling Socrates to undertake Charmides' education came to nothing. And I'm wondering how we are supposed to know that, at least on the basis of what we're given in the Charmides. So if, and I agree this is a big if, and this is part of what I'm trying to suggest we should at least take on board. You know, Socrates is this deeply morally ambiguous figure. It seems to me that he's the sort of figure who could have sort of catastrophically bad effects on the people he associates with, as well as, you know, C.F. Plato, good, rather than just thinking, oh, bad Charmides, you know, should have taken the Socratic medicine but didn't. We might think, perhaps more troublingly, well, he did, or at least the text, I mean, given the way the text talks about, and again, you analyze this very nicely, this stuff about, you know, I'll stay with you as many days as you like, and Critias says, yeah, don't abandon him, you know, it will be a sign that you're Sophron, Charmides, says Critias right at the end, if you don't abandon Socrates. We're at least, for all the text says, there is a lasting association there. So, okay, that's my case for. I'm sorry it's been so narrowly focused. I suppose my question to you, I'm not, and I know, apologies I couldn't get this to you in advance. So feel free, you know, respond to or not to the individual bits. But my question that I hope will raise a bit of discussion, I'd be really interested in your views on, is, do you have a sort of general view, I know it's a big question, about the issue of the relation between Plato and Socrates? And as I say, I'm inspired by the fact that you yourself talk of Plato as being critical of Socrates sort of intellectually. Do you have a sort of general view about the relation in the specific context of the Charmides? I know we're talking about the Charmides, but obviously if you have thoughts sort of from elsewhere in the corpus, I'd be really interested to hear. So that's it. Thank you. Thanks for listening, Woolf, and everyone.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Raphael. You raised many important points, and I'm sure that Woolf would want to answer to each one of them now. But in order to be mindful of the time, I would let Alex first make his comments, and then let Woolf reply to all the comments together. So let me just very briefly introduce Alex Long, who is a senior lecturer in classics at the University of St. Andrews. He is currently, together with Ursula Woolf, the editor of Phronesis. He has worked on numerous aspects of ancient Greek and Roman philosophy. I will here only briefly recall his monograph, Death and Immortality in Ancient Philosophy, published by CUP in 2009, and also the edited volume Immortality in Ancient Philosophy, which we very happily presented here last year. So thank you, Alex, for being here again with us and for having accepted to discuss Woolf's book. The floor.
Sure. Well, many thanks indeed to you for organising this, and congratulations to Woolf. And I have to say, I found Raphael's comments absolutely fascinating. So I'm in a way regretting the fact that you've got to hear from me before we get to hear Woolf's response to them. But never mind. Let's stick to the format. So as Raphael was indicating, I'm going to start with some comments on the book's form. The book describes itself as an interpretive commentary, and it's certainly very easy to consult for those who want discussion of a particular part of the dialogue, such as the charm or the question of whether knowledge of knowledge would be beneficial to have. But it's, as Raphael was saying, it's unlike most of the book's called commentaries in that it's enjoyable to read in a few settings from start to end, and it seems to have been designed with that kind of reader in mind. And I think the point that it has all, the virtues of a monograph and the virtues of a commentary is exactly right. And I think sort of reading it in a few sittings is how it should be read in order to appreciate how Wohler makes a case for her main claim. So typically she outlines her interpretation in the introduction, and then she develops it further over the main body of the book. Okay, as you go through the book, you'll also find lots of astute discussions of points of detail and, to my mind, lots of persuasive criticisms of previous scholarship. Two topics seem to me to stand out. The first is the complexity of the character Critias, which Wohler mentioned in her own introduction. And the second is the issue of whether the Charmides rejects claims made or methods adopted elsewhere in Plato's dialogues. So I'm going to start with the representation of Critias. To quote from the introduction, Critias is carefully wrapped in ambiguity from the beginning to the end of the narrative, end quote. There's then a similar comment on Charmides. And Wohler argues, as we've already heard, that Critias is not presented as a two-dimensional or one-dimensional villain. I mean, on the one hand, she notes that Critias, the character's behavior in the dialogue, can hardly fail to put us in mind of the actions of the 30, of which the historical Critias was one of the leaders. I mean, think, for example, of his and Charmides' high-handed co-option of Socrates at the end of the work. Wohler argues in the book's introduction that one reason why Plato made Critias the main interlocutor was in order to indicate the deficiency of science as a political ideal. So to quote, "In all probability, the temperate ruler as Critias conceives of him will be entirely inappropriate to steer the ship of state," end quote. So she notes the obvious negative political resonances. On the other hand, she argues that Critias is not presented as motivated purely by political ideology or social prejudice. So she highlights, both in her introductory remarks just now and of course in the book itself, a passage where Critias is presented with an argument whose upshot is that a person can be temperate without realizing it. I mean, at this point, they're defining sophrosyne as the doing or making of good things. And Socrates objects that, well, there are plenty of cases where a specialist, despite acting appropriately and within the scope of his expertise, doesn't know whether his actions have good outcomes or not. So a doctor may not know whether the drugs he's prescribing are actually beneficial to the patient and so on. So it follows that if sophrosyne is to act beneficially, the doctor may possess the virtue and yet be unaware of it. And Critias reacts very strongly against that, just to such an extent that he's willing to, he states willingness to abandon his previous admissions. Better, he says, to admit having been in error than to say that a person ignorant about himself has sophrosyne. And as Wohler, I think, rightly points out, Critias's reaction here has nothing to do with a prejudice against craftsmen. He's unswervingly committed to the impossibility of possessing sophrosyne while being ignorant of one's own ethical standing. And although Wohler doesn't say this is an argument that could be transferred up the social ladder without losing its force. I mean, supposing again we're defining sophrosyne as performing good or beneficial actions, well, a king or an oligarchic ruler, even in possession of expertise, can't know the action of all his actions. So here too, if we stick to this definition of sophrosyne, there would be the same problem. It's possible to be both in possession of sophrosyne and ignorant as to whether one possesses it. Okay, so I think the Wohler's point that it's not, that the rejection of it is not down to social prejudices, that's absolutely right. Wohler adds that this episode must also qualify any view of the character Critias as driven by philotomia, or personal ambition, alone, when he has to choose between admitting previous error and accepting that people with sophrosyne can be blind to their possession of it. He accepts the admission of error on his own part without hesitation. So, I mean, I found myself very persuaded by the case made over the course of the book for the complexity of the character Critias. One small point where I disagree is the brief comment that the historical Critias was a tyrant, and you can find other scholars saying the same thing. I mean, if that were right, that would have very significant implications for how we relate this dialogue to Plato's political writing elsewhere, above all in the Republic. Now, we do find in an ancient scholion on the Timaeus the claim that Critias was a tyrant, but although it's an ancient view of Critias, it's a post-Platonic view of him. So in Plato's Apology, the rule of the 30 is presented not as tyranny, but as oligarchy. And similarly, Xenophon, when reporting a charge made against Socrates, describes Critias not as a tyrant, but as the most violent member of an oligarchy. Another scholion, this time on the orator Aeschines, reports that after Critias's death, he was commemorated as a champion of oligarchy. Apparently, Critias's monument showed personified oligarchy holding a torch and setting fire to democracy, and carried the words, "This commemorates the valiant men who for a short time restrained the accursed demos of the Athenians from their hubris." Okay, so imagine if it has a sort of horrific image of one woman setting fire to another, standing for oligarchy and democracy, respectively. I mean, this suggests, by the way, that there was a personal connection between Critias and Sophrosyne beyond the association between Sophrosyne and oligarchic values more generally. Hubris was a central way of acting without Sophrosyne, and at least according to this scholion, Critias was commemorated after his death as a restrainer of the hubris of the Athenian demos. Okay, so much for Critias. Now for the second thread that runs through the whole book, whether the Charmides reject methods or claims made by Socrates in other Platonic dialogues. Under that heading, Woolf considers Socrates and self-knowledge, the analogy between technai and the other virtues, elenchus, and philosopher rulers in the Republic. And Woolf rejects readings according to which the Charmides rejects what's attributed to Socrates elsewhere. In her words, we are to rethink, not reject. For example, she distinguishes between Socrates' own conception of self-knowledge in this dialogue, the Charmides, and Critias's conception of it, with the result that showing problems for Critias's conception doesn't drag down Socrates' conception with them. Similarly, she argues that the architectonic knowledge discussed in the Charmides is different from the knowledge of philosopher rulers in the Republic, and so doesn't pre-announce and pre-criticize that part of the Republic. So to quote, Critias's temperate rulers would govern by virtue of their capacity to distinguish science from non-science and experts from non-experts, and to delegate and supervise tasks accordingly. The philosopher king is, on the contrary, supposed to govern by somehow bringing to bear on empirical matters a kind of knowledge that transcends these latter and includes, all importantly, the contemplation of the form of the good, end quote. So here too, Socrates' critique of Critias's conception of temperance leaves standing what the Socrates of another dialogue, in this case the Republic, defends. That too I found persuasive. I'll add that the description of expert political rule in the Charmides says nothing about what the subordinate people themselves think about the allocation of jobs. In the Republic, by contrast, a city only has temperance if everyone, the producers included, agree and sincerely believe that the division of power is appropriate. And Socrates, again in the Republic, puts a lot of emphasis on the fact that the producers don't think of the guards as their masters, but as their protectors. And the guards regard producers not as their slaves, but as their paymasters. So in the Republic, Socrates considers important not only what knowledge or expertise each person, such as the producers, has, but a much wider cognitive range, encompassing the producers' beliefs and their attitudes to the rulers. Those, even if that's not knowledge, it still matters for the unity and temperance of the city. And of course, the distinction between knowledge and non-knowledge that we find in the Charmides is crude compared to the fine-grained distinctions between cognitive states that we find in the central books of the Republic. Okay, I'm going to leave aside the analogy between technai and the virtues, even though Woolf says quite a lot about that. I'm going to move on to Socratic method. And this is, I think, where Woolf finds the most self-criticism, or criticism by the Socrates of the Charmides of the Socrates we meet in other dialogues. Woolf argues that the Charmides shows some serious limitations and shortcomings, that's a little quotation, in Socratic methods, both as a means of education and as a means of inquiry. So starting with education, Charmides and Critias seem to have learned little from their exchange with Socrates, and Woolf concludes from this that more than Socratic questioning is needed to instill virtue in young men. Now for Socratic questioning as a means of inquiry, she points to Socrates' self-criticism at the dialogue's ending and to an earlier passage where Socrates admits his own limitations and says that a great man is needed instead. The context is a discussion of relatives. Of those items that bear a relation to something, are there some that bear that relation only to themselves and to other members of the same class? For example, a seeing that's a seeing of itself and of other seeings. If there are some, do they include the reflexive knowledge that they're calling temperance? Socrates says that he's unable to answer that question and he's unable to perform the necessary division. Now, again, I'm going back to the question of Socratic method in education. The Charmides is hardly unique in putting Socrates in dialogue with characters, the historical counterpart of whom didn't become virtuous after their deaths. So think of Alcibiades or Meno in the dialogue that bears his name, and what we hear of the historical Meno's greed and deceitfulness from Xenophon. It seems to me absolutely characteristic of Plato to make Socrates engage with a challenging interlocutor, to have that interlocutor make limited progress. So, for example, Meno becomes more respectful and engaged as the dialogue goes on, but to include pre-echoes of historical events that suggest that the progress was never completed. And showing that Socrates can reform, at least to a limited or temporary extent, must have seemed a more convincing line of defense than showing Socrates transforming and thoroughly reforming an interlocutor in a fictional conversation. I mean, after all, if Plato's contemporaries were presented with the latter, Socratic education having a transformative effect, someone hostile to Socratic education could simply bring up the historical Alcibiades as a counterexample. Turning now to Socrates' self-criticism and his comments on his own limitations, a general point, it seems to me that it's difficult at such moments to determine who exactly is the Socrates that's criticized or said to be limited. Is it the Socrates character of this dialogue? Is it the Socrates character of Plato's other dialogues? Or is it the historical Socrates, or some combination of those figures? So, for example, when in the Theaetetus, Socrates says that his own abilities are limited to midwifery, should we take that to be a retrospective interpretation of the Socrates character in other Platonic dialogues? Or, as David Sedley suggested, is that a comment on the historical Socrates and his contribution to philosophy? Or is Plato confining the comment to the Socrates of this, the Socrates character of this dialogue, and announcing the limitations and the mode of inquiry that the Socrates character will have in this particular dialogue? Moreover, it seems to me that Plato sometimes has reasons to stress Socrates' limitations that have nothing to do with a critical comment on the Socrates character in other works. So, for example, in the Republic, why does Socrates not produce a full account of goodness or a definition of goodness? Well, I mean, I think there are philosophical advantages in having Socrates refrain from doing so. By avoiding putting into Socrates' mouth a definition of goodness in the Republic, Plato avoids giving his readers the impression that his defense of the goodness of justice in that work relies on a particular and perhaps eccentric conception of what goodness is. So he has good reason not to make Socrates define goodness in the Republic. But by putting the explanation of the absence in terms of Socrates' inability, he would dearly love to, but he can't, or at least he can't on this occasion, Plato can set aside that question, the question of defining defining goodness, without giving the impression that understanding goodness is a low priority for philosophy. And perhaps we should adopt a similar interpretation to the great man passage, the great man and relatives passage on the Charmides. Plato does not want to suggest that the study of relatives and dividing relatives into different kinds lacks value as a philosophical enterprise. All the same, in a work about virtue, he may feel it appropriate to keep human welfare and practical life in mind, and to considering what practical difference the knowledge they're discussing would make. So Socrates' comments on his own inability to perform the division of relatives may be motivated not so much by a reappraisal of the Socrates character as by a need for delicacy and compromise in the treatment of a particular topic. Sometimes, I mean, perhaps very often, Plato needs to bracket a technical subject without talking down its importance. I mean, in fact, I think the way Plato does philosophy makes that a very frequent need. I mean, he's always suggesting ways in which the inquiry could sort of branch out in different directions, but he nonetheless wants to make progress in the main line of inquiry here. So those other realms of inquiry need to be set apart without, in most cases, indicating that they lack importance. Okay, so I think this is to argue roughly in the same direction as Woolf does in much of the book. I mean, Woolf very often argues that Socrates' positions are not set, Socrates' positions in other dialogues are not set aside or rejected in the Charmides. But perhaps we should go further and say that some passages that give the impression of criticizing or evaluating Socrates actually have a completely different motivation. Okay, anyway, I'd love to hear what Woolf says to that, but I also really want to hear what she has to say about Raphael's points about the ambiguity of Socrates in the Charmides. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you, really. And Woolf, please, you can now reply to both Alex and Raphael's point.
All right. Well,
and sorry for having made you wait so long.
No, never mind. Thank you very much, both. These are wonderful points. And let me begin with Raphael, and then maybe short comebacks if I misunderstand something or I omit something, and the same goes for Alex, of course. So how did I come to this form of writing? Well, reflecting upon the relevant comment by Alex, I was thinking perhaps to talk about an interpretative commentary. The commentary word is not particularly felicitous, but I really didn't know what else to call this. So how did I come to this, first of all? Well, it evolved over time. I've been more intensely thinking about the Charmides for about 2 decades. And it is a dialogue that I do remember very vividly. The first time that it just caught me was as graduate student in Cambridge, where we had a seminar, and then eventually I just put it aside and I knew I'm going to return. So it really evolved over time, mainly, I think, in part, but crucially, because of dissatisfaction. I was dissatisfied every time I was trying to write something, or was in fact writing something, and did write and publish something that was narrow and focused and specific, and tried to make a partial, a small or kind of medium range, normal sort of contribution to a particular point, because I had this feeling that I am focusing on something, and yet there is a whole huge extent of seaweeds around me, and that I thought I think I am doing something, but in fact there are all these threads that I cannot tie together. And one thing that was a decisive moment was when I did what is the subject to Plato's Charmides for John Glucker's Festschrift, and that is when I tied together the vastly varied interpretations in different groups, and I started really thinking about the dialectic between them and how they bear on the text. So and so the form that this took emerged slowly through a realization that it was a whole interpretation that was being formed inside me, rather than particular answers to particular questions. I don't know, does this make any sense? Does it address what you are asking?
That makes perfect sense, Woolf. And I think, I mean, it's peculiarly satisfying. I think it's really hard to do. I mean, I'm not somebody who finds it easy to do that. I mean, in that sense, you know, I write, you know, however, I hope my monograph is untypical in some ways. It's typical in that it takes a particular stand,
yeah,
as if I mean, I love Robert Nozick's. I don't necessarily like the work, but I love the preface to Anarchy, State and Utopia, where he makes a kind of similar point that, you know, we all, you know, we put forward our interpretations if, well, really, this is the only reasonable interpretation one can make. And we don't often enough say what must surely be true, that every interpretation has good things and every interpretation helps us understand. And that there must be a proper way of approaching this kind of interpretation that does justice to that and that shows how you can bring different approaches together and
finally, what my own strategy was, because I'm basically getting engaged with a very great deal of the literature. I mean, going back to the 19th century, and what I chose to do, and I do take combative stances towards it, you know, I mean, expressed in my own way, which admittedly is not, you know, it's more conciliatory than that. Still, I do disagree intensely with many things. And what finally I did was to put that engagement in footnotes. And in fact, what was emerging was exactly the interpretation through this very complex dialectic. So, second point, is there a scope for critical distance between Socrates and Plato, and how do I view that relation? First of all, well, I think there's a very large scope. I think you're absolutely right about that. And I loved the way you put it, that there is, we have a narrator. This is formally perspectival already, right there. But overall, I have never tended to identify Socrates with Plato. And I remember that when I was very young, I was really losing patience with Plato very easily. Socrates was really getting on my nerves. And I never thought that this is Plato. I always thought this is a character. And I always had the feeling, and still have it, that Plato is trying things out. Some of them he's much more committed to, others much less. Intellectualism, I think, really is a big topic for Plato. And not surprisingly, I think he's a rationalist in many ways. Of course, the idea that moral characteristics amount to forms of knowledge. How are we to understand that? That, I think, is problematic, very close to Plato's heart. But it doesn't follow that the science of science, for instance, is particularly close to Plato's heart. I mean, but it may well be a view out there. Still, however, and I'm coming to your next point, as in plays, we often see the action through the eyes of the protagonists, or the protagonist, the one. I think it is Plato wants us to do this regarding many of his dialogues, because there is this recurring figure of Socrates, and the other interlocutors switch and change, and in a way revolve around him. Sometimes he's a heroic figure, other times he's always odd, most of the times provocative, always unusual, always ambiguous. Is he morally ambiguous? I think it depends on what we mean by this. So I think there is one sense, and I believe you were pointing in that direction. Tell me if you meant something more. But there is one sense in which Plato's Socrates, the character, says this straight out in the Apology, when he says, you know, it's not my fault, there are these youths, they take my way of speaking, my method, if you will, and then they make fun of others, and then people get angry at me. So there is a kind of moral if that is what you mean by morally ambiguous, I think it's very much a kind of ambiguity that Gorgias is trying to claim for himself in the Gorgias. But morally ambiguous in the sense of whether he is a good person, as good as a human being can be within human limitations. I don't think he's morally ambiguous in that way as a Plato character at all. And the last thing I'd like to address is, how do we know? Oh, I want to say something about Chaerephon. So Chaerephon, you're absolutely right. He's not, one can say, oh, come on, he's not a manic in the way he greets Socrates. Here is a survivor and a close friend. And of course, he is exuberant. But then he goes on to behave inappropriately, to make inappropriate comments about Charmides. He's too intense about Charmides' beauty. He tells us, wait until he strips off and then you will forget the beauty of his face. So there's a very much verging on the lecherous and with an intensity that is very great. I think all this, as it were, can be conveyed by the intensity. If Manikos indicates intensity, there is more than just his greeting of Socrates, it seems to me. And as for the distance between how do we know that there isn't a lasting association between Charmides and Socrates, and just Charmides turned out wrong, moral ambiguity. I don't have a proof for this, but my interpretation of the last scene is that Socrates is depicted as aloof, having grown aloof. And the two cousins are in cahoots. They conspire as how to make Socrates take Charmides on, and he stands back and he asks, they read to him the act, and he just asks some questions or makes some comments. So my sense is that he is depicted as having grown uninvolved. So that's the only grounds on which I think I would defend that interpretation. I mean, that sense of mine that I convey in the book. Now, turning to did I omit anything serious here? Is that okay? Yeah. Then I'd like to turn to Alex's comments now. And again, thank you very much, Alex. The title, I said what I had to say. Basically, I did want people that wanted to look at a particular passage. I mean, the idea of commentary is that too, that together with the overall interpretation. If somebody wants to look at Critias's speech regarding the Delphic oracle, one can go there, find the text, and find a discussion of details. So it is in that I kind of would say the commentary quality lies. Regarding the characters, I think that the reason behind Plato's choice of Critias, for instance, is both dramatic and philosophical. He's known from what we can tell from his fragments, he's known to be a rationalist and an intellectualist. And he also is known to be an authoritarian before he became one of the 30. He did belong to the oligarchic party. And there was, I'm going to say in a moment a bit more about this. There is authoritarianism, at least so far as the Athenian narrative is concerned. There is authoritarianism connected to the oligarchic party in Athens at that time. So Let me actually address this point. I do agree with you, Alex, that Critias was never a tyrant in the technical sense of the term. And the two instances in which I refer to him as a tyrant in pages 11 and 36 that you do mention, I use the term in a non-technical sense. Critias was called a tyrant. The regime of the 30 was called a tyranny by later authors, in the sense that they exercised absolute and unaccountable authority over the citizens and the state. And it is important to point out that recent studies on Greek oligarchy do confirm this picture. I mean, Simonton's book, for instance, does suggest strongly that oligarchic regimes, and certainly that includes the 30, deserve in some ways the name of tyranny, in important ways the name of tyranny, because they are authoritarian, they are repressive, they are manipulative, and they are extremely resistant to accountability and the distribution of power, any distribution of power. I have very little to say about Alex's comments on the question whether the Charmides rejects crucial aspects of the Socratic method and philosophy. I believe that his rendering of my own position is entirely accurate. And I agree very much, Alex, with your remark that contrary to the Republic, in the passage of the dream, the Charmides said nothing about the subject's thoughts on the delegation and execution of tasks by the rulers, or more generally about the subject's beliefs and attitudes towards the rulers. And also, Alex, I think you are right to point out that the Charmides is not unique in putting Socrates in dialogue with characters whose historical counterparts never became virtues. Alcibiades being the notable example, but this also meets Raphael's point here regarding moral ambiguity. To reply to Alex's query as to who is the Socrates that is criticized, the Socrates of the Charmides, not the narrator, but the participant, the protagonist, criticizes his own dialectical performance as an interlocutor in the debate that has just been concluded. So the first focus of self-criticism, and the main one, I think, is the Charmides itself, is within the text. But also, I think, his criticisms can be applied to the performance of Socrates as a character in other so-called Socratic dialogues, so-called early dialogues. I don't want to touch on the so-called here. I make no claim about the historical Socrates. I am not concerned with that topic at all. And to conclude, I would like to say, Alex, that I find very intriguing and very valuable your final comment, that sometimes passages giving the impression of evaluating or of criticizing the character Socrates have in fact a very different motivation and function. And I think it is worth pursuing this suggestion by looking at particular cases throughout the dialogues. So I don't know whether there is anything else that either of you would like me to address, but I found the comments of both of you extremely well thought-provoking and very, very subtle. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vula. Again, I don't know if either Alex or Raphael would want to make any further comments. If you want, please feel free to do so. Otherwise,
yes, but we could
okay,
debate
yes.
all day. So having seen that, no, I won't, because having seen the very distinguished list of other participants, I think I'd love to hear others take. But thanks for
okay. So if there are any questions, do please raise your hand, and we can open the floor to a bigger discussion. Although we know it is a bit late, but still. Okay. If there is no question yet, I will ask a question myself, which is a question of out of curiosity. So when I read the introduction, I thought that the introduction was very useful even to people like me who are not very well acquainted with the Charmides, insofar as it outlines a lot. It gives you a guide through the different interpretations, what their strengths are, and why you think that I mean they do not respond to your own reading to what their shortcomings are. And you have said, and Alex and Raphael comment upon this a little bit, is that it is a fairly common approach to take the text as a historical and biographical account, right?
Yes.
Okay, and according to which the ultimate purpose of the Charmides would be to either defend or the two cousins or dissociate Socrates from them. So, and you also make it very clear that you sit on your approach is different, that you have an analytic approach, and you want to sit in that tradition, and that's the most important thing for you is the argument and how it is constructed. So the purpose is explicitly philosophical. However, since you sometimes say that the Charmides is also deliberately open-ended to a certain extent, and it opens the path to possible readings. So I was wondering if you have any take about how, if and how this ambiguity of the characters, not only a moral ambiguity, but an ambiguity from the kind of reading that I can have of them, has or could have impacted the readers who had in mind the Athenian politics from the 5th century BC. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Julia. I think that the purpose for the ambiguity is, or one purpose anyway, is dramatic. It is to make, I mean, it's inevitable for the readers of the dialogue not to look back at lost opportunities. And I think Charmides was a lost opportunity for Athens. I think Critias was even more so. I mean, it's not one thing that is not ambiguous in the Charmides, in my view, is Critias's formidable dialectical capacity. I mean, it is the way, for instance, he's able to, from particular examples, to draw inferences, the way he's able to follow extremely complicated things. I mean, what we do see there is a powerful mind at work. And I don't think in the Socratic dialogues there is anything like Critias in terms of an interlocutor. I would say not even after we move beyond the so-called Socratic dialogues and until you reach the late period. Again, I am using chronological terms. I don't necessarily subscribe to developmentalism, but I mean, beyond the Republic, as it were. But Critias is really a character that stands out. And I do think that at the time when the Charmides is written, one thing I found, just doing some historical research in connection to the Republic, is the politics of Athens are actually consolidated after the 30 fell. And so there is more distance that the Athenian audience at least has with regard to the events of the past, and less passion. So I think the ambiguity of characters gives them the opportunity to rethink things. And so dramatically, I think this is a very well calculated feature.
Thank you very much, Bula. Unfortunately, my internet was coming and going, so I couldn't hear all the response. But I will listen to the recordings so to know what you replied to my question. Sorry about this. There was a question.
Anyway, so.
Okay. Yes, exactly. There was a question in the chat, but since I just rejoined the meeting, I have no question in the chat. So if one of you could please read it out loud, either Federico or Arianna.
I am reading this question by Joshua.
Yeah.
Macro is not working, or maybe Bula, you can read it. I mean,
is that the question about the Battle of Potidea?
Yeah.
I think it was an extremely traumatic moment for Athenian history. It was there is some uncertainty as to which one of the two battles this was. There were two battles very close in time. One, I think, at 429, and the other at 430 and 429, I think. But both were moments of loss, and one of them was a bloodbath. So I believe that this is the one that is referred to here. And I think that the background is part of the dramatic context. It's the idea that Socrates turns his back on death and catastrophe. He turns his back to the temple of Basile, who is probably Persephone, the goddess of Hades. And he is getting into the gymnasium, which is brimming with light. And he's looking for promising young men, promising in beauty and in philosophy. I think is part of the contrast that is created there at the beginning of the dialogue, part of the drama, as it were.
There is another question. You can, if there is another question, there.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you all for your presentations. I learned a lot from the discussion. I confess I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, but I was wondering if you could address a particular moment in the dialogue that continues to trouble me as I continue to think about the Charmides. And it's the moment at 165C where Socrates says, well, if sophrosune is a matter of knowing something using gignoskein language, he says, it must be an episteme, and thus it must be an episteme of something. And that then leads to the attempt to understand sophrosune as an episteme, analogous to other kinds of episteme. Oh, it has to have an object. What's it's going to be? Its distinct domain. And it seems that, to me, that the problems for Critias's account of sophrosune come from understanding sophrosune on the model of an episteme. And when Socrates, I like your distinction between Socrates's version of sophrosune and Critias's, and later on in the dialogue, when Socrates seems to revert back to his version, he tends to use gignoskein language, gnosis language. Yes. Do you think that the different language matters and that there is something misguided about thinking of sophrosune as an episteme?
I think that it may matter. The gignoskein and oida vocabulary is a vocabulary that comes up at least twice at crucial moments. The one is the instance you are referring to. The other is at 167a, when Socrates re-articulates, paraphrases, with Critias's consent, a science of itself and science simpliciter and non-science, in terms of knowing what one knows and doesn't, but believes, but what one knows and doesn't, and what other people know and don't know. And then we move again to the science of science vocabulary and the examination of that strictly reflexive concept. And I think in both cases, the addressee is the reader, is, remember, there is a different way to think about virtue. In terms, if I may use again the apology here, in terms of human knowledge, in terms of gignoskin, things that one oide, as he uses, and this is a term that again is a non-specific term. I think in the Charmides he reserves, they reserve episteme, and it's Critias that makes the slip from episteme to, which Socrates might have used, because episteme is also a non-technical term. It's not just technical. It can be used as a synonym of gnosis, but it is Critias that turns it into, without argument, the famous slip from episteme to episteme tis. So from science of oneself to science of itself. And there it is technical. So yes, I think the vocabulary is important, and I think it is the way, at least I read it, is in connection to the two competing conceptions. And the one is shadowy. I mean, the Socratic conception is, it's not fleshed out, but I think it's pointed to regularly through, in great part, through a different vocabulary, yes, and different cognitive terms.
Thank you.
Yes, Alex, if you have a question, you can go.
If there's really no one else, I'm waiting. Well, I've been thinking over Raphael's point about ambiguity, and I'd be interested to know what both Woolf and he would think about the suggestion that the Charmides again and again put Socrates in a difficult position as to how complicit to be with the actions of others. So when you find, lots of these cases, it's not so much sort of the Socrates character as ambiguous, but it's just a really difficult decision. So if you want to be sort of socially engaged, and some other people are engaging in some banter about the physical beauty of a younger person, well, just how far should you distance yourself from that, and just how severely should you criticize them? And I mean, Socrates, he manages to sort of correct them, but not in a very severe way. He said, well, I think if you looked at his soul, he would look even more beautiful, which is a kind of correction, but not in the way to indicate this is an inappropriate way to talk about a younger person. Or at the end, when they're sort of press ganging him to be part of Charmides' education and not really giving him the option of saying no. I mean, do you sort of dig your heels in and then say, no, I'm not going to be part of it? But given this is supposed to have an educational goal, even if you feel the way in which the demand is being made is inappropriate, do you just go along with that? Or at the start, if, you know, with Chirophone, if someone on seeing you return seems to be a bit too enthusiastic to see you, do you correct them, and do you say, well, no, calm down? I mean, lots of other people were there too, which find out how they got it. Or do you just show them the sort of the grace and let that rest? I mean, these are cases where I think, you know, in Greek, in ancient Greek, these are cases that do call for sophrosyne, but the right response or the measured response is really hard to call in each of those cases.
I think, Rafe, do you want to begin?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting, Alex, and I suppose that's one way of reading what's going on. But again, doesn't that? I mean, my worry there would be that sort of presupposes that Socrates is trying to do the right thing and is then, as it were, doing the best he can. But of course, Socrates calls Chaerephon manikos. So I mean, now what's interesting, what tells us, what's sort of telling there is, of course, the structure of we haven't talked about the anonymous auditor. So this sort of middle layer between sort of Plato writing the dialogue, the discussants discussing, and then Socrates narrating to this strange anonymous person. So we sometimes get to know what Socrates thinks by that device. And one of the things we know is that Socrates reads Chaerephon's behavior as manikos. Now, if you then say, yeah, so we've got an example of manikos behavior there. So how does Socrates respond in a way that doesn't sort of insult? But I suppose my question was one step further back, which is, why should we take Socrates' characterization as the way things are, as the way, as it were, Plato thinks we look through why should we think we look through Socrates' eyes?
But can't we take it as a kind of playful remark? Oh, well, come on. I know.
Sure. Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, it's not.
We know
absolutely.
He's mad, but
yeah, it's not a clinical diagnosis. It's meant in a play. I mean, they're good mates.
It's meant in a playful exception.
But why would you say that even in that spirit? I mean, really? You know, it's not like. I mean, you know, he hasn't seen Socrates for a few weeks and he's terribly excited. Socrates has just survived a battle where most people have died. He's been away for sort of 3 years or whatever it is. I think there's at least a question about whether the tone I completely accept. It's said in an affectionate, playful tone, but really, manikos in that circumstance, it says, to me, it still says something very distinctive about, so maybe to put it in a way that we can agree on, sort of put it in a relative, they're very distinctive about Socrates, that's how he chooses to characterize that behavior in that context. I completely accept the point about tone, but to me it's still very, very striking that we get.
Well, I mean, I surely you must be right, you know, in emphasizing the oddness in many cases. I mean, it's not by accident that Socrates becomes the Stoic saint, right? The impassibility is part of it. It's there again. Socrates is open to very many different interpretations across the board of the corpus. And one aspect I think that is there in the text is the Stoic aspect. Someone who considers manikos his friend, who sees him having escaped the slaughterhouse that Potidea was, and jumps up to run to him. And it is affectionate. It also indicates a distance and some dispassionateness. I think you would agree with that, wouldn't you?
Of a kind of fairly extreme kind, given the circumstances. I mean, that would be. I mean, it sort of, at least within the drama, that would be my answer to the question about why it starts off with the battle, because I think it gives all sorts of dramatic possibilities to start encouraging us as readers to think about Tsouna. I think we'd agree on that, Woolf. I mean, whether one, you know, I wouldn't as quickly as you, as it were, position that as, so we know from the get-go Socrates, Tsouna and Chaerephon a bit loopy, but that we're being invited to see a very different way of thinking about what Tsouna might be, including, to me, the possibility that this is a guy who is so radical and so extreme that we may not simply be in a position to just sort of uncritically accept that this is a paradigm. This is somebody who this is somebody who makes us think about what we thought was true about these moral characteristics, but not in a way that makes us think, oh yeah, right, so now we know what Tsouna really is. It's what Socrates does. I think it's not that. I think it's, wait a minute, now we've got to start wondering about this all over again. but including wondering whether Socrates himself was a dangerous figure in some ways, and that he could have radically different effects on different people, and that there isn't we're not invited to say, so we know what Sophrosuna is, as it were, in person, and now let's see if we can find out the definition. I think it's more.
Yeah,
more
I think that is the last bit. I think, I mean, I need to think more about this. And so what I'm going to say right now is just a first impression and off the top of my head. But I think we may part eventually company at this last point, that Socrates was a dangerous figure, a threatening figure, a subversive figure in a way that bears on moral badness. That he was a subversive figure, there is no doubt. They wouldn't have killed him otherwise. But I am talking not about the historical Socrates at all. I am interested in Plato's Socrates. And it is that Socrates that I think you and I do converge on many points. We may be parting company at that last point.
Federico, you have a follow-up?
This discussion, I mean, this is very interesting also because, well, I'm just submitting a feeling I have about Plato's descriptions of Socrates having a certain behavior. Well, in that case, I mean, behaviors and discussions about virtue are sometimes on different levels. I mean, Socrates' behaviors, Socrates is atopos, and his discussions are typical of a person who is atopos. Nonetheless, his virtuous acting is recognized as such even by those who are not philosophers or by people who are not virtuous. I mean, for instance, in the symposium, at the very end, Alcibiades, who is not a philosopher at all, and whom Plato wants to distance from Socrates, anyway recognizes Socrates acting virtuously. The misunderstanding is that Alcibiades just says, look, this is virtue. Well, Plato wouldn't say this. I mean, Plato would just say this is a correct behavior, which Socrates has because he has knowledge or, well, because he's a philosopher or whatever. But from a purely, I mean, factual point of view, there's a sort of coincidence. So in this way, I mean, it may be a sort of model for people who are not philosophers, still remaining someone different from the mass. And indeed, once he enters the debate, he shows that he's above common people, I would say. So there is also there might be also this shift, and indeed, when we see Socrates talking to people, there we see why Socrates really acts virtuously.
Yeah, thank you, Federico.
Thank you, Federico. I will grab this occasion to conclude. Oh, well, there is one very last question. I will let Martin Seat ask this last question, and then we're going to close the discussion because we're sort of running late. You have to unmute you.
This doesn't get to the deepest level of the dialogue, but since so many people raised the question of moral ambiguity, I thought it might be helpful to mention that there are two dialogues or two people, young people who go into politics that Plato shows in the dialogues. Charmides and Critias on the one hand, and Alcibiades on the other. And these are ones whose later political careers didn't just drift away from Socrates, they conspicuously lacked the virtues with which they discussed with Socrates about. So that I mean, it really is almost a diametrical opposite. I mean, with Alcibiades, they talk about justice with the champion of the unjust invasion of Sicily, etc. And Critias is the bloodthirstiest of the tyrants. So the question is, Plato seems to present Socrates, and the only presentations he has of him as really a teacher of politics to eventual politicians, as a failure as a teacher of politics. In the Gorgias, he says, you know, I'm the true politikos because unlike Pericles, Pericles can't transmit his, his virtue to others, so that's a failure. What does Socrates have to show for this? I mean, at best, you could say his success is Plato, for example, and since the battle was brought up, Socrates is very concerned about the future of philosophy. That's, first thing, what's philosophy like here? He might die any day, and so he's concerned about, whether the transmission of philosophy. He's had a student, Critias, who fails, in effect, to understand what. There's a question of intellectual ambiguity here, I think. I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you very much for this comment. I don't know whether Raphael, do you want to say something, speak to that?
Not really, because I think Martin and I are sort of coming from roughly the same position. And of course, you'd expect me to say, well, yes, it's Alcibiades that is praising Socrates. And again, I just at least want to say that has to be something that we're not supposed to say. I mean, you started off, Martin, by saying, well, look, this non-philosopher guy says great things about Socrates, so isn't that great? And then I think you moved in your remark to saying something that I would be sympathetic with, which is, well, hang on, this is Alcibiades who's shown praising Socrates. This is Socrates who's shown. I mean, this is a very well-worn story. I think what's nice about the Charmides, what's nice about the way that Woolf has inspired some of these questions is these questions I think are very applicable to the Charmides, but haven't been as much sort of aired in the context of the Charmides as, say, the symposium. But in a way, the symposium is a sort of classic exhibit, I suppose, for people who do want to wonder about how Socrates is portrayed and whether he's portrayed as a kind of morally dangerous as well as potentially morally transformative person. And I think that's probably a good.
I was thinking of the dialogue Alcibiades.
May I?
I'm sorry, I apologize. I think it was about the symposium. You're right. The Alcibiades is a whole different question. Sorry, I misunderstood, Martin. But let Woolf, please.
May I make a last comment, Julia? I mean, I think this idea that he can be deeply morally transformative, but also deeply dangerous morally. Perhaps there is a parallel to that idea in the Republic, when we are told that Socrates tells us that the most dangerous people for the state are the gifted ones. They are the ones that have great philosophical gifts, and somehow they go astray. And on the surface, I mean, the obvious examples of this regarding Socratic interlocutors are Critias and Alcibiades Wells. But perhaps that kind of question can be raised regarding Socrates as well.
Well, thank you very much. And this was a beautiful comment to end our discussion with. I want to thank you all, Woolf, Alex, and Raphael, very much, all the people who asked questions. This was very enriching as a discussion. I feel I've learned very much. So thank you very much again for being here, for having given us your time, and thank you a lot. I will hand it over to Federico, who is going to present the next. No, Federico doesn't. You are muted.
Muted.
Yes, Julia, do you have the flyer at hand?
No, not really. That's why I was handing it over to you. Okay. But Ariana is sharing.
So of course, I join Julia in thanking everybody, and I'm just, inviting you to the next session of the Chefs. It's next Thursday. So we'll just go Plotinus, so a huge job, with the New Cambridge Companion to Plotinus, edited by Lloyd Gerson, James Wilberding. That will be presented by Anna Motta from Naples and Alexandra Michalewski from Paris. And so thank you so much again also on my behalf to Vula, to Raphael, to Alex, and to everybody attending this meeting. And thank you so much. Have a nice evening.
Thank